Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you live again from Film Fanatic headquarters. It is Sunday at 9:40. Hope everyone's doing good. I hope everyone had a splendid weekend. It's been a beautiful weekend here weather-wise. A little cold again, but pretty darn nice. Super fun super fun times on the weekends. So, yeah, I want to thank, like I always start these shows, I want to thank again for, thanks everybody for supporting this channel, with subscribing, with the new subscribers that have been joining this little gang of mine, and, and people commenting on the videos. It's always a lot of fun. Always trying to venture into some like new territory with some new films. Always trying to put the spotlight on a lot of films that are not very well known, or at least from like my perspective, a lot of films that were maybe at one point had a good ride and then kind of fell into like obscurity. And most of the focus of this channel is really about that very same thing. I was talking to a friend the other day, and he was asking me about the channel, and I was just kind of, in a nutshell, I told him, well, it started off as a hobby. As far as like, everybody has a little hobby or a little side thing that they do. Whether people collect, baseball cards or what have you, and for me, it's like my first thing that I started doing, kind of on the side, was like collecting movies, like years and years ago with DVDs. And since then, I like was explaining, since then it's become more of a kind of a lifestyle and kind of an obsession, something that I seek out. And then I was telling him about the channel, the YouTube channel, and the things that I do around it, and then that I have an Instagram page and a Facebook page, and it kind of started off with the Facebook page, and it's kind of evolved to this. But and I was explaining that, yeah, the main focus is just bringing movies that I love to the table, but mainly trying to focus on movies that are pretty obscure and mostly centered in the exploitation world. But again, I love all kinds of movies. I love all kinds of things. So I try to mix things up as much as I can. So it's a lot of fun. And, and for me, it's, when I say it's like a way of life, I always think of it in terms of how films inspire me through, especially through the music, the music that I write. That's the biggest component. So it's even gravitated to something that's been even bigger for me over the years because of where my band Quantum, when that band came about, and kind of where it's evolved, and the things that really inspire that band around film. And I've talked about it before in the past, where I have some experience working in to some capacity, working as a director in and working in films. I started out with all of a very, very low budget, of course, but it started off with the shooting various music videos for a band that I was in many years ago, Full Contact Kitty, and we kind of modeled that whole kind of vibe and world off of the Velvet Underground, and particularly around Andy Warhol and their collaborations at the Factory in New York City in the early 70s, where they would basically use this performance space as kind of like an art experience, where they would have these various films and videos projected on the band, and that's kind of where it started for me as far as maybe, well, I guess to a degree, like throwing my hat into the ring and trying it out. It was something I always thought about. I've always thought about, in a lot of ways, I've always thought about music on a visual sense. So it started off with that. It was I don't know, it was a real interesting experience in my 20s when I started listening to certain kinds of music. It started making me think of, like, maybe the mood of a particular piece of music started bringing about like these visions or ideas of like a landscape. Like maybe the music made me feel like I was might have gave me a feeling like that I was in this, you know, in the woods, or that I was, in to some capacity in nature, or like in a green valley or in a mountainous range, or during, or maybe the music made me feel like it was, it put me in a place of where it was kind of the, like a summer afternoon, a beautiful summer afternoon, or like a really harsh winter storm. Um, I always had that kind of thing of where I always, you know, even since I was a kid, but when, especially like in my 20s and stuff, I started to like really I noticed, and I had never, it was never that strong before that, but I remember in my 20s there were certain bands and groups that I was starting to check out that really put me in this visual state. It was a really interesting experience where I started thinking of it would kind of transport me, and I would think of environments, and it kind of evolved from there and got more. It became more and more of a thing when I would to where I would like listen to, put in an album after a few years, say, of having that kind of experience, and it would, it would transport me to that kind of a place. Like, if I put on, say, an electronic album by a group that I really loved, like, say, Autechre, it would put me in this place of, where there was like, it would put me in this like science fiction world, or like a dystopian landscape. It made me think of movies like Blade Runner, or some kind of futuristic cityscape. Made me think of, being in outer space, and all kinds of things like that. And then if I would listen to, say, some real quiet ambient music, it would put me in, in this kind of serene, tranquil place, maybe where I started thinking of things like where I was in the mountains or in the forest. And then it really happened too on the other extreme, kind of on the other extreme side of things, music wise, but very, very similar in a lot of ways. But like, for instance, black metal made me think of when I got into black metal as a kid. And then I still very much love that music. And I've been into a lot of that music, revisiting a lot of that music lately and checking out some new bands. That put me in that same kind of thing of where I was in the mountains or some kind of winter landscape. And, so it kind of always was a thing. And it got to a point where I put in an album and it would literally, I would think of things visually. And then, years and years later, when Full Contact Kitty came about, that was right around the time I started really developing a love for film. And that's, and Velvet Underground was a huge influence. I still love them. They're one of the greatest rock and roll bands ever. And when I saw that, that was the first band that I was aware of as a kid that, kind of did a real visual presentation. But then, in a lot of ways, going back even further, it was groups like, say, Kiss that introduced this really cool aesthetic of where it was like a real visual thing. Like suddenly being a fan of comic books, it was suddenly like this whole visual thing. And it wasn't just, seeing a band show up on stage with like jeans and t-shirts. It was like a theatrical journey. And like I said, being a fan of comic books growing up as a kid, it was like seeing these living, real life superheroes on stage, but with a visual thing. And it was it just trans had this magic to it that it could transport you even more as a viewer. And then when so a combination of all those things, and then when eventually when Full Contact Kitty came about, that was my first band that I was in where we wrote original music, and it was, you know, very much influenced by a lot of electronic music, but then also a lot of films, also a lot of directors. One of the biggest being David Lynch. And when I discovered, you know, Velvet Underground, that was the next kind of thing of where I saw a band doing a visual thing too with film. So that helped inspire me to like, oh, okay, maybe I can try something like that. And that's when I first started doing shooting videos. We would shoot these short videos, and then after we got a bunch of material, we started for a few years. We would bring a projector to our shows and project them on the band, and that's kind of where the whole thing started for me, as far as blurring that line, even though it's really kind of the same thing, but incorporating a visual component with the music to try to like, you know, give people maybe something to remember, or give people something interesting to look at. I've never really been a fan, even before I was kind of in that mode. I was never really a fan of bands, and especially now, but I was never really a fan of like bands kind of just showing up. And of course, it depends on the context of what kind of music the group is trying to present. But I was never really a big fan of bands that would just show up, uh, in their street clothes and just, plug in their instruments and play. And, even in a lot of cases, like if the music was really, really great, it would still like, you know, uh, have an impact. But even in those situations, I always felt like it would be cool to see something visual, some kind of like, whether it was some kind of minimalist light show or a way of dress, some kind of theatrical flair. I always thought like that would make the experience even more engrossing and engaging. So that always stuck with me. And when Full Contact Kitty, we started doing that visual kind of presentation, and we started to do that, and we did it for a couple of years, and it was really fun. And then that evolved to where we were incorporating more theatrical things. And it was, and then a few years later, I decided to get back into, try to actually make a film, and and then and ended up having that experience, and then it evolved to where I am now, to where all of those desires to kind of incorporate influences from films and various things around it. When I started Quantum, that started to be this kind of this big pool where I could take all of those desires or interests from film, and all the things that encompasses, and I would throw that in that pool. And I noticed that was like kind of satisfying, that weird part of my brain, and ever since then it's been just a thing, and it's a natural thing for me. I just love incorporating a visual sense, to give people an experience. Of course, the music has to be as strong as possible, and has to be, at the end of the day, I feel like that's got to be the calling card, and that's what people will, if they like it or they don't like it. But ultimately, that will be the calling card of what the band is. But the whole visual thing, I always thought, whether it's on a very minimalist, whether it's a very minimalist presentation or something that's a little bit more over the top, that, that would just kind of give something more to people watching the show, and give them something a little bit more to kind of maybe sink their teeth into. So that was always a thing, and it's gone on to always to now just be for our band. It's just a regular part of how we operate. And I've noticed since since I've developed this, I feel like this outlet, and it's come to kind of fruition. It's increased my appetite for films even more, where there's a lot of, you know, direct things that I get from films, and I try to incorporate it. And I usually for the most part, when I incorporate like a visual thing for the band for Quantum, it's usually I try to keep it on the subtle side to a degree. I want it to be kind of balancing out with the music somehow. I want the music to hopefully be the main thing, but then have the visual thing to kind of just enhance it. You have some groups out there that really take that visual thing. I've noticed that now within the last 10 years, but some groups will take that visual thing and really go over the top, like groups like Ghost. Well, growing up, there was Gore, and Rammstein. 9 Inch Nails was a band that really was an influential thing for that kind of idea. There was a whole bunch of bands that would really do that kind of thing. And for me, I always wanted it to be, a little bit more subtle, but definitely there. And sometimes I've found, and again, it's just a matter of opinion, but sometimes I've found that like some groups, and well, another band that's a big example of that, which I'm not a big fan of, but another band that really took that kind of thing to an extreme, this band called Slipknot, a '90s metal band. They used masks and props and all these kinds of things. But one thing that I found with a lot of those bands that were sometimes taking that kind of thing and going way over the top, I found that like their music kind of became secondary, and I kind of felt like, and again, it's just a matter of opinion, but if you took a band, say like War, where they use the props and fake blood and it's like way over the top and in your face, and it's very fun, and it's like a carnival kind of atmosphere. But if you took away, say, the visual thing, and suddenly it was just them, by themselves without the aid of the theatrical, and it was just their music, I don't think people would really like it. I don't think it would have any weight to it. I don't think their music is really very good. I don't think it's strong enough by itself. So I always thought, okay, well, whether people like it or not, but that's just a matter of opinion. But if I can make the music the main thing and make that wherever we're playing or whatever we're doing, make that hopefully as strong as possible, but make that the ultimate. If people dig it, make that the main thing, and have these other things, on the visual thing, as aids to enhance it. So that's just something I've always thought about, and that's something that I, always am thinking about how to do live. When we start off as a band with Quantum, a lot of our shows, like for instance, we would play a lot of regular indoor shows, and we would play, art galleries or clubs, or there was a time we were playing a lot of house parties, and we would have the aid and and also playing in theaters. So we had the aid of like being in a dark space, so we could really create that vibe. And one of the interesting things that like happened, because things are very different now, I think, for um, gigs in general, but gigs for me personally, but gigs in general, is that the last few years, people's habits have changed quite a bit. So I think people don't really stay out as late as they used to. I notice lots of musical events end early, or much more earlier than they used to. Like last night, I went to see a friend play. My friend Vince Gabriel, who is a really, he's a local legend, great blues guitar player, and he was playing a gig the other night at this really good barbecue last night place in Thomason with Glenn Dubois, another local legend, amazing bass player, and Jeff Densmore, a really good friend, amazing percussionist and drummer. And they were playing a gig, but it was at 5 to 8, and so by like 8 o'clock, or about 10 to 7, or 10 to 8, the place at this at this venue, this the station, which is a really great barbecue place, but it's a cool venue, clears out and everybody's gone. Everybody's left, and then the band's done, and then that's the end of the night. And I look at my clock, look at my the time on my phone, and I'm like, oh wait, it's 8 o'clock, and it's like, a Saturday night, and 8 o'clock is here, and the party's over, and it was a great time. It was a great set of music. They played for about 3 hours, but that was unheard of, say 5 or 10 years ago, or 10 years ago more so, where the bands wouldn't start cranking until about 9, sometimes later. But now a late night show is like 10 o'clock, so it's very different. There still are late night shows or gigs that bands play, but typically they end really early. Like lately, I've been playing a lot of gigs where we start at 4 and we're done by 7, or we start at 5, we're done by 7, and it's on a Friday or Saturday night, and it's it's cool. I mean, in one regard, musicians don't get home at 5 in the morning anymore, which was like commonplace, and those kinds of things. I think one thing that's better around it is it's nice to be done a little bit earlier and to like have the night free if you want to do something. And I noticed the pay is better for those musicians these days around those kinds of gigs. I know for me it is. Um, so that's nice, but also it's a thing of where you know, uh, okay, what do you want to do after? If there is anything to do, I went to see some other music the other night, and then I had heard about this DJ thing going on in Camden, so I went to check that out, and there was a lot of people at both events, and they were both done, and it was on Friday night actually. My gig had gotten done by 7, so I was able to hit up both of those places. And I went to the DJ thing after, and I realized at both events, and there was a lot of people at both events, those things were all done at 10, and that's really early, even, and that's considered like late night. So it's very different. And I think because a lot of those things, for us, with Quantum, a lot of our gigs, of course, when we play gigs, are done on the early side as well. And a lot of things were, especially summertime, are outside. So you're in the broad daylight. So a lot of our gigs were like in mid afternoon or early afternoon, or 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. But during the summer, and then you don't have the light. It's still light out. So I noticed we're not really playing in like dark spaces anymore. We're not really playing on the later side anymore. We're playing, most of our gigs are outside. So I was like trying to figure out how to adapt that, because at one point when we were playing gigs inside or whatnot, we had, we would use a little bit of an extra light kind of presentation to kind of enhance the show. And suddenly we can't really do that. So I think in terms of like, how can I still have that presentation, with, but being that we're in a broad daylight. So I had to like adapt different ideas to kind of create that vibe still. And so started using more masks and wigs and little costume kind of things, and little props that I use to kind of, you know, have that as a thing for being for the situation that we're like playing outside in the broad daylight. So always interesting. But getting back to films, again, all completely tied to films. All completely tied to films. All of those things. The use of masks, the even the pacing of certain films, the way I typically like a lot of films that are kind of slow burners, where you're getting these little bits of information, and before you know it, you're, if it's clicking, before you know it, you're in the palm of the hand of the filmmaker, and you're in that ride, you're strapped in, you're ready to go, and wherever they'll take you, you'll go, kind of thing. And I think this movie here, Prisoners, is a prime time example of that very thing. That is an example of what I just said. This was the first movie of Denis Villeneuve that I've ever seen, that I had ever seen. And Denis Villeneuve is easily one of my favorite directors. He's a Canadian director. He's made so many incredible movies. I think his track record is just so stellar. I love all of his films. I love that he is a risk taker. I love that he's really innovative, and I one of the things that I love about his work is how he'll jump around uh, from genre to genre. He's not a genre specific director. He doesn't only make, say, crime movies or horror movies or action movies or suspense movies. He kind of bounces back with all of those things. I mean, he's done action movies, he's done suspense films, he's done movies that have horror elements, he's done science fiction movies, he's done mysteries. He's kind of ventured into all these different genres of films, and he's easily, I think, one of the best directors around today. And Prisoners was the first movie that I saw of his that turned me on to him, and I was just blown away. I got this movie, and it's hard to believe this came out in 2013, and the cast is just amazing. Jake Gyllenhaal, Hugh Jackman, Paul Dano, David Dastelmach, Terrence Howard, Melissa Leo, Mario Bello. Um, I saw this movie in such a funny, like, unassuming way. I remember seeing. It's hard to believe this came out in 2013, but I remember around that time I had heard about this movie. I think I had seen a trailer for it, and I thought, oh, that looks pretty good. I've always liked Hugh Jackman. I mostly knew him from playing Wolverine in the X-Men movies, and always a fan of his stuff. I hadn't really seen him at that point. I don't think I'd really seen Hugh Jackman in any other kinds of films outside of him playing Wolverine, but I always thought he was great, and I knew he had a background in Broadway, and I knew he had, like, some serious acting chops, and but I hadn't really ever seen him in anything outside of the comic book world. And Jake Gyllenhaal was an actor I always loved. I thought, he was in some really fantastic movies. Uh, Probably my favorite film of his was Donnie Darko, which is just a mind blowing movie. That's going to be a movie I'll eventually do a show on. Uh, just an incredible movie. I knew him from that. Brokeback Mountain, which is a really incredible movie. I'd seen him in a bunch of different movies and playing different roles, and I always thought he was really good. Um, where I saw, like, compared to, say, Hugh Jackman, where I kind of only saw him play Wolverine. Even though I'm a huge fan of the X Men franchise, but with Jake Gyllenhaal, I had seen him in lots of different films. And Terrence Howard, I had seen him in one film, and I thought he was pretty good. And then Bello, I was pretty familiar with her work. She was in a lot of interesting, cool movies. I'd seen her in this movie called Autofocus. I'd seen her in quite a few different things. I'd seen her in a couple of David Cronenberg movies. Always really liked her, and always thought she was really great. But I remember seeing this as a seeing the trailer for it, and I thought, okay, this looks like a pretty good kind of murder mystery movie. But I thought, okay, it might be pretty good. And I remember renting it. It had just come out on DVD, and I didn't know who Denis Villeneuve was, the director. First time, hearing about him, and I rented the movie on DVD when it came out, and I watched it, and I was totally blown away by this movie. I was just like blown away. And Paul Dano, that was also the first film of his that I had ever seen. I like I no, actually no, I take that back. Paul Dano, I had just seen. It was a couple of years before, but the Paul Thomas Anderson movie, There Will Be Blood, which came out a couple of years I think before, which is with Daniel Day Lewis and Paul Dano, which is such an amazing film. Paul Dano plays a preacher in it, and I could not believe how great he was in it. So I had just seen that film maybe a couple of years before, and I saw that he was in this. So I knew him only from There Will Be Blood, which is just an amazing movie. So I was like, wow, like he's awesome. Like I've seen him definitely stretch out as an actor. But again, so I watched this on DVD, and I was completely blown away by how riveting this film is. It just blew me away, and 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 I remember I watched it a couple of days later after I rented. I had it for a few days or whatever, and I watched it pretty much back. I watched it like a second time right after. I was just blown away by just how incredibly suspenseful this film is, and the detective aspect, and also how dark this movie is. It's so dark and it's so brutal. Um, yeah, it is an intense movie. It really is such a movie that goes to places that you don't really expect, and then I found myself being kind of taken aback as a viewer, and kind of blown away that you know, they did go there, because there's like, where they go into this thing of where, you know, wow, as a viewer, I found myself being like, wow, are they going to really go there? And then they do. I was just like, holy crap. I was just blown away. And this movie, like, literally, I don't think was seen by anybody. This movie was a total bomb in the box office. I remember it had a theatrical release, and it was only in the theaters for like a really short time, and it like commercial was it bombed, and I remember being like, how is that possible? Like, this is one of the best movies. Arguably, it's probably the best movie of that year, 2013, and it was one of the best movies I had seen in a while. And I was just totally blown away by it. I was like, how is that possible? And it was the first. And then after I saw this, I was like, who is this guy? This Canadian director, Denis Villeneuve. Like, visually, the music, everything about this film was just so incredible, so incredible. And I was totally, like, again, I was totally captivated by this film. And also the cinematography by Roger Deakins. Just, just completely captivated. And since then, ever since I saw this film, I really started to pay attention to Denis Villeneuve as a director. And I have pretty much all of his films on DVD and Blu-ray. He did a film right after this that's called Enemy, that is also with Jake Gyllenhaal. Just an incredible movie. That movie has more of a, that's like a, it's a really trippy movie. It's so different than this, but Enemy has this. It's like a modern day kind of film noir kind of thing, but it has like, and like I mentioned in the beginning of the show, Denis Villeneuve really jumps around into different genres of films, and Enemy has like elements of sci-fi, but it also has heavy elements of horror, and it's a suspense-filled movie. It's a very suspense-driven film, but it's a really interesting movie because it's a drama, but a mystery, but it's got this real like kind of modern film noir kind of vibe, and but it has again, like I said, has a sci-fi influence, and it very much has a horror influence to it. So it was really interesting. And then after that, and I that movie is just incredible. I remember buying that. I bought that on Blu-ray, and I, which I hate myself for doing, but a guy that I used to play music with, I had let him borrow it, and he never gave it back to me, and I was so aggravated. So I've never gotten it back. But anyway, after that, I was just like, Denis Villeneuve is amazing. After and then so I just continued to follow his career. I and then shortly after that, he put out a movie with Benicio del Toro and James Brolin or Josh Brolin called Sicario, which is about, and again, a totally different kind of genre, which is about the drug cartels and the CIA, and it's about the alleged war on drugs, but it's really about the U.S. The U.S. is a policy on drug trade and their ties in with the Mexican drug cartels. And that movie is like one of the most intense movies ever. And the action in that film is just incredible. It's a total suspense action movie. But that movie is literally from like the beginning to the end, it's like a nail biting experience. I have that movie on Blu-ray. I bought it as soon as was able to get it. As soon as it was available, I bought it on Blu-ray, and it's easily. I have some, obviously I have a lot of Blu-rays, and that's mostly where I spend most of my money at or for. And Sicario is definitely one of the best quality Blu-rays that I have. Like the music, the sight and the sound, the cinematography. It is such a tremendously intense experience. I mean, it is gripping from the very beginning to the end, and especially the last 20 minutes of that film. It's just like it's so awesome. Uh, it's hard to say. It might almost be my favorite Denis Villeneuve film, but it's such a masterpiece, and it's one of the most intense experiences on Blu-ray. Like it really is. I would have loved to have seen it uh, in the film in the theater. Amazing movie, amazing movie. I've always loved Benicio del Toro, and it is easily probably his one of his best roles, if not his best role. And then after that, he did another film where he ventured into full on science fiction called The Arrival. And that movie is just completely spectacular. One of the best one of the most original and one of the most incredible science fiction movies that I think that's ever come out. I did get a chance to see that film in the theater, and that movie is just an amazing film. It's really it's a real haunting film, and again, it has some horror elements into it, and all of his films, all of Denis Villeneuve's films, all have this very mysterious kind of vibe to them. They all feel like you're watching like this slow burn mystery kind of unfolding before your eyes. And all of his films seem to be like mystery movies, even when he's obviously crossing these genres of like elements of horror to science fiction to, you know, movies about serial killers or drug cartels. They all have this thing of where they're all like essentially like murder mystery movies. So there's like always this, you know, burning level of suspense in all of his films, which is so awesome. And The Arrival, like again, like I said, is one of the most hypnotic science fiction experiences I ever had. I did get a chance to see that in the theater, and it's such an emotional movie. The music and everything is just such a haunting movie, and it's so original. It goes and it's not predictable. It really causes you to really think about a lot of things. And I remember almost being when I saw that in the theater, I remember because it's such an emotional movie. I remember almost getting choked up and almost teary eyed when I watched it in the theater, and that doesn't happen to me very often. But I almost like started crying because it was such an emotional movie, especially the first half. But just an amazing film, and I have that on Blu-ray as well. And that movie as well is just an incredible experience on Blu-ray. Uh, so just an amazing track record. And then after that, after Sicario, it was announced. I remember reading an article that Denis Villeneuve was going to be directing the Blade Runner sequel, and I couldn't believe it. I was just like, "What?" My mind was blown. And that movie was delayed for quite a while, and finally it came out, and I got to see it in the theater, and that was, I would have to say, it was one of the best. Seeing that in the theater, and I didn't really, I knew it was going to be, I knew some things about it. I knew Ryan Gosling was in it, who I love. I knew Harrison Ford was going to be in it again, and I knew, Denis Villeneuve was directing it, and I was like, wow, how are they going to do this? Like, because the original Blade Runner by Ridley Scott is one of my all-time favorite movies. I mean, just amazing. It might be my favorite sci-fi movie of all time, but just such a masterpiece. And I'm like, how are they going to do this? And this was like going to be like a direct sequel, like set, I don't know, 30 years after the first one. And there was talks for years and years that this was going to happen, and that Ridley Scott was originally going to direct it, and that it was going to be all these different things, and it never happened. But Ridley Scott ended up producing this film, and Denis Villeneuve directed it, and I saw it in the theater, and it was easily one of the best film going experiences I've ever had. Definitely on my top, five experiences as far as having that truly like transformative experience in the dark theater. Like seeing Blade Runner 2049 in the theater was just amazing. I saw it at the Colonial Theater. I remember we sat in the balcony, and they have a really good, or they did. They're closed. They've been closed for a while, unfortunately, but they have a really good sound system in Dreamland, especially in Dreamland. Like really nice surround sound speakers. They have a subwoofer, I believe. And I remember I went with a couple of friends, and we saw it. We sat in the balcony. We sat like right in the middle, and the sound was just mind blowing. It was just so awesome, and I think it's one of the best sequels ever made. I love that movie to death. I since then I bought that film also. I have that on Blu-ray. Um, just an amazing film. Just an absolutely amazing film. One of the best sequels I've ever seen. I can't get enough of that film. I watched last year. I watched both together. I did that, and it was really a cool experience where I watched the original Blade Runner, and then I watched Blade Runner 2049 back to back, and it was great. It was really cool doing it that way because it was really cohesive, the whole story, and but yet different. He took it. Denis Villeneuve took it in different directions, and also gave you something new. He wasn't trying to remake Blade Runner, which I thought was cool. It had it had definitely a an homage to that, or a tipping of the hat for for what Ridley Scott created. But it was his own thing, totally unique, and went into very very different areas. Um, Amazing film. And then after that, it was shortly announced that he was going to be redoing Dune, which is my all-time favorite science fiction novel of all time. And I love a lot of the incarnations of Dune. I did a show on Dune recently for the channel. That movie, I was really bummed out because I did not get a chance to see it in the theater, but I finally saw it on DVD, and that movie is just incredible. I think it's easily the best version of Dune ever, and again, to have Denis Villeneuve at the helm was probably the smartest possible decision that the studios could have done. It's a masterpiece. I think it's an amazing film, and I think given that the story of Dune, is very complex, and it's not really a commercial story. He made it, and you could easily see and watch that movie without having to have read the book. and he laid it out in such a way that it has all these great complex ideas, but it's really easy to understand. It's not too dense, but yet it's all intact, and it's a masterpiece. I think it's an incredible movie. And really recently, I bought Dune on Blu-ray. I'd only seen it on DVD, but I bought it on Blu-ray pretty recently, and that's the show that I did on it. And it's amazing. It's I was blown away by it. It's incredible. It's easily the best thing, the best movie about Dune and those series of books. I love the original one by David Lynch, but this one blows it out of the water. Amazing, amazing. And now there's going to be Denis Villeneuve has broken it up into chapters, so now chapter two for Dune is going to be coming out, I think, this summer, which I can't wait. Just can't wait. So Denis Villeneuve cannot do any. I feel like all of the movies he's done, they're all so different. And the other thing too that's interesting is his movies are not like, even though he's kind of considered like a highbrow director, he doesn't make a lot of his films are not commercial in a lot of ways. Like they're not really typical movies that I think people are gonna like take the family to go see and eat a bunch of popcorn. They're all like pretty heavy duty. They incorporate lots of different elements of different genres, but they bring about a lot of interesting questions, and they're kind of heavy. They're kind of the storylines are kind of complex, but they have a lot of weight to them, and they go into areas that you're really surprised by. And so it's not there's never like a cookie cutter thing up around his films. There's never and none of his films are predictable. Like every time I watch one of his films, I'm never like, well, I can put the movie in and then go to the bathroom or make something to eat and be like, okay, this is what's going to happen, and then sit down and then that's what ends up happening. No, that doesn't happen. Like you can't. I find you can't take your eyes off of his films, and it always goes into. He always defies your expectations, and it always goes into areas where you don't expect it. So they're not very commercial films, even though they are big budget films. He takes risks. I think he takes chances, and he's a visionary. I think he's one of the greatest directors. I put him on the same pedestal as like my some of my favorite all time directors, like Akira Kurosawa and Stanley Kubrick. I feel like he's like the modern Kubrick, a risk taker, and doing things like kind of in a commercial light, but then not relying on kind of a formulaic concept with his films. The other thing that was just so tremendous about this film, Prisoners, which again, this is a masterpiece. This was my introduction to Denis Villeneuve. This was also my introduction to Johan Johannesson, who is easily my favorite film composer. He unfortunately passed away a few years ago, and it was very, very sad. But Johan Johannesson is a composer, or was a composer from Iceland, who creates some of the most gorgeous and thought-provoking music I've ever heard in my life. Not just in soundtracks, not just for film scores, but just in general. The film scores that he worked on all of Denis Villeneuve's movies. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, so he did not work on the last movie that he did as a composer when he was alive with Denis Villeneuve was Sicario. And the soundtrack for that film is just so intense. And again, that movie also, even though it's not a horror movie really by any means, it does have horror elements. The soundtrack for that film is so intense and so dark that it almost feels like you're like listening to like the Omen soundtrack. Like it's really dark. It's got horror elements. And Johan Johannesson, is that guy. And he unfortunately passed away after that. And Hans Zimmer took over the work of working took over that position, who was a again a brilliant composer, and he did the film scores for Blade Runner 2049 and Dune, and then the upcoming sequel. And I love Hans Zimmer. I think the greatest thing that he's ever done is probably The Dark Knight. Like, that's amazing. And he's worked on all of the Christopher Nolan films, which are just amazing. And Interstellar is one of my other favorites of his. He's done some incredible work. But Johan Johannesson is next level. Like, he was, he, no comparison when you listen to his music. Again, the same kind of thing of where, as a composer, Johan Johannesson had a real extensive world, uh, a real eclectic background. He, worked a lot in the classical world. He also worked in the electronic world. He also worked in the real experimental world. And he would always kind of combine all of these elements. And he would use a lot of like unorthodox instruments and instrumentations. He would even use these old like tape machines and use those where he would manipulate them in the setting of using classical instruments. Just really interesting things, and like create this really weird and eerie vibe, but in like a classical context. Very, and have this real experimental kind of edge to all of his music. Not again, just like Villeneuve, kind of from a commercial or from a big budget kind of canvas or on a big budget canvas, but then adding elements that where it's not predictable and it has this edge, it has a grit to it, and it's like it's raw, it's nasty, it's dirty, and it has an edge. It's not, whereas like Hans Zimmer, he's an amazing director, but Hans Zimmer, where I think he definitely has stretched moments of where he's stretched out. Particularly around Blade Runner, I think he's did some really great stuff, and Dune, I thought he did a really great job with that. But he doesn't have, I feel like compared to Johan Johannesson, he doesn't have that level of edginess, and he's not willing to kind of go a little bit further with incorporating other non-traditional elements. Hans Zimmer kind of does a certain kind of thing, uses a certain kind of template all the time, which is amazing and fabulous. Like if he decides, I noticed with some of his work, if he's going to set out to create a score around classical instruments or that classical instrumentation within like an orchestra, he'll stick with that, and he'll really do some amazing things within those confines. Or if he does say something like, well, Blade Runner, he'll use that template of using like synths and electronic instruments to kind of create that dystopian vibe that Blade Runner has, and he'll stick very much in that kind of structure, in that form, and it's amazing, great. Um, but he won't. I noticed as a composer, he won't really go outside of that kind of preconceived template. He won't really mess with it and like put a little dirt in there, and he won't like really blend various different templates. Whereas Johan Johannesson would do that. He would incorporate everything and all these different elements, and there he kind of created. He wasn't really he didn't really function in a way of setting up a template or whatnot, and okay, and then following these 1 through 10, where there's a good, a right way and a wrong way, or where it's going to be by the numbers to a degree in those confines, and there's going to be more or less these rules around that. That's kind of how I feel Hans Zimmer kind of operates, and without any disrespect, because I think he's kind of a genius, but Johannesson would have a template as an introduction to what he's creating, but at the same time he'll like he'll throw out all of like quote unquote like your conventional rules, and he'll like create his own rules. He'll create his own kind of standard, and he'll like pull from different genres, and he'll like push the perimeters of what the sound can do. And it's harder to define what he's doing. You know, it's not really uh, there's too many elements that he's introducing that are that are from different walks of life to really like put a label on it as to what it is. Um, he kind of defied that. The greatest thing, my favorite soundtrack that Johannesson has done. Well, Sicario again, and the music in Prisoners is amazing. Now that I'm talking about it, I'm gonna have to watch this again tonight. I just love this freaking movie. I'll probably do a show. I believe I did a couple of shows on some of his films. I think I did a show on Sicario, on Denis Villeneuve's Sicario, but I'll have to do more shows on his films. But and the film score on this is amazing. It's really subtle, but it's really really great. It's amazing. But I think like Sicario is probably, as far as the film score work by Johannesson, is probably my favorite. The Arrival is just mind blowing. But my favorite film score that he's ever done was for this movie by Nicolas Cage, starring Nicolas Cage, Mandy. It is like the most transcending soundtrack film score I've ever heard. It's like it's essentially a horror movie, but the music is so horrific and so atmospheric and so beautiful all at once. And again, very unconventional. It doesn't really fit into the classical world or the electronic world or the straight up soundtrack world. It has a lot of different things going on. He's got all these, you know, that's when I listen to Johannesson's music, I feel like when he was working, he was, you know, he's got a lot of different tools. He's got, you know, I think of him as like a painter, and he's got, you know, if you look at certain painters, they might have like say 10 different colors to choose from, or one size canvas to choose from. Well, Theo Johannesson, he's got 100 different colors to choose from, and he's got numerous different kinds of canvases to choose from. And I just feel like he had so many different things going on, and he would just kind of integrate that into his work. Just amazing. And I think the same goes for Denis Villeneuve. Uh, so many different things going on in his films, and he doesn't stick with like a convention. He really uh, is unpredictable as a director. He really, you know, pushes those boundaries, and he's a risk taker. You know, just amazing, just amazing. Um, so yeah, 2013. The other thing too about Prisoners is this movie. I think is probably the greatest performance that Hugh Jackman's ever done. He is so amazing in this film, and after I saw this film, Hugh Jackman kind of became one of my favorite actors. I no longer thought of him as just, even though he's great in it, I never no longer thought of him as Logan anymore. Of just the guy who plays Wolverine, which he's awesome in. I was like, this guy is like an unbelievable actor. Like he could do anything, literally anything. And ever since then, I've like followed his career, and Hugh Jackman's kind of emerged as one of my favorite actors, who can literally do anything. Uh, this is easily my favorite. My I think Hugh Jackman's best role ever. He's such a complicated, damaged person in this, and he's like so vulnerable, but yet he's like a terrifying person in it too, and so desperate and just amazing movie, amazing movie. And this was like again, like I said in the beginning of the show, this was my introduction to Denis Villeneuve, and this is a good way to start. So damn good. Um, so please check this movie out. I don't own this on Blu-ray, which I don't know why. I have this DVD copy, which is actually pretty good. I have most of his other films, and on Blu-ray, but this one I don't for some reason. So uh, you gotta check this out. Prisoners, 2013, amazing, amazing movie. Thank you again, and we will see you next time. Peace.